This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com. Hey guys, my name is Major. I'm here with Darshan Kulkarni, and today we are going to be discussing the government shutdown and how it actually affects patient centricity.
Great topic, though, isn't it? Pretty timely, Major. So have you been following the government shutdown? Do you think it's really affected normal people's lives at all?
It's affected a few of my friends. I mean, it's one of those federal workers can't really discuss, their personal opinions on it. They just want to get back to work, and I totally understand. Or if they are working, they just want to receive their paycheck. So, and I'm sure everyone listening has become over inundated with commentary and just the firestorm of the media on the government shutdown and what surrounds it. But what we're actually talking about today is how the government shutdown affects patient care or patients, patient centricity, right? That's the direction we're going.
Yeah, I think in the end, the reason the federal government exists is to help its citizens. And the reason healthcare providers and the pharma industry is part of this whole thing is to help patients. So instead of looking at how is each individual pharma company going to be impacted, let's really get to the crux of the question. Let's really ask the question, how are patients impacted? And interestingly enough, that's the exact same position that the FDA through Commissioner Scott Gottlieb is taking. They're going, okay, we're going to prioritize things that have direct impact on patients and on people and consumers who would be directly affected by this federal shutdown. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of the direction we're taking.
Okay. So in the government shutdown, what is actually being shut down with the FDA?
It's an interesting question. I think there are two levels to this whole question. So the first question that we have to look at is who is affected. Everyone thinks that it's the entire federal government that is shut down. Interestingly enough, only a quarter of the federal agencies are actually affected because the rest of them had already been funded for 2019. So since we're in 2019, apparently 3/4 of the federal agencies are not impacted by the shutdown. The second part, and this affects about 800,000 federal workers, which is a huge number of people. But when you think about who could have been affected, it's significantly more than that. So I think that's really kind of interesting. The FDA is impacted because their budget hadn't been figured out and their funding hadn't been figured out. Which takes you to the next question of, well, how are we finding out about this? And I think it's really interesting because the FDA has traditionally communicated using guidances. We've talked about guidances so many times. We've talked about regulations. And those they're still using to a certain extent. But Commissioner Gottlieb is actually primarily using Twitter and using social media to communicate. What I find is really interesting about this is when you start going through the Twitter accounts, people are using his tweets to ask questions, which is resulting in an interactive communication, not always
in an official capacity.
Like concurrently.
Is that?
What's that?
I mean,
yeah, in an official capacity.
Right.
So they're saying, you said this, did you mean blah, 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 or did you not? And he's not necessarily answering that question at that same second. But what he is doing is he'll come back and go, some of you asked this question, here's the answer to that question, which I think is really useful, right? So we as a organization, as a country, we didn't really have a direct way of communicating with our leaders, and social media has really enabled that. For whatever you want to say about President Trump, he does use social media. It's enabled a communication with him. And this is not a pro-Trump or anti-Trump type of conversation. I just think it's an interesting world to be in now.
So when it comes to the FDA, when you're talking about what specifically is being shut down, obviously the non-critical departments are being shut down. What isn't shut down, emergency response to foodborne illness, supporting high-end risk in food and medical product recalls, which I think is a really important topic, pursuing civil investigations, criminal investigations, screening imported food, medical products, and addressing critical public health issues. But what if that affects patient centricity? Like what?
So a really good way of right. So a really good way of looking at this is twofold. So number one, what the FDA has tried to do is prioritize its goals. There are some things that the FDA already has funding for. So there are carryover balances from last year from the 21st Century Cures Act and from the opioid funding. They're still continuing to use that money. Under what's called PDUFA, there are carryover balances from previous times. So companies have already paid the money that's due to the government to say, will you please look at these applications? The FDA is using that money to continue operations to a certain extent. However, to the extent they have other monies, what they're doing is they're using that for mission critical goals, and those mission critical goals are public health and safety. So that's sort of been interesting because, like you said, they're looking at food recalls and outbreaks, which again can impact patients and impact people,
right,
and have a significant impact in public health. What they are not doing, for example, is routine work that would have a long-term impact. They're really looking at more short-term stuff, and we will talk a little bit further about what kind of long-term impact stuff they're still getting into, but that's because they have the right funding in place.
Okay.
Adverse events of drugs, as you mentioned, and they are still continuing to pursue the civil and criminal investigations, which I think is interesting primarily because I would have thought those things take years to develop. But I guess one of the goals here is to make sure that people don't think, oh, I'm not going to be affected. I can go and sort of be and do ridiculous things right now. They're saying we still retain those rights. We're still going to continue those rights. And we're still going to enforce those privileges and rights that we would have. So from a patient standpoint, I think what the takeaway message is the FDA is doing whatever it can to make sure that patients and consumers are minimally impacted. And that's coming up in both research, it's going into new drug applications, it's going to generic drugs, and it's even going to tobacco. And we, just to sort of do a 50,000-foot view on that, if you're doing, say, a emergency investigational new drug application, the FDA is still saying we will, even though we have a crunch in funding, we will still look at those emergency INDs. They're coming in and saying if you are conducting important clinical research and we're going to, in certain situations, we will continue to look at those requests. They're saying that if a patient, for example, what we saw with like the right to try and all of those types of issues, if a patient requires access to an investigational drug, the FDA will make it a priority to respond as quickly as possible. And when you go on Twitter, you see communication saying, I requested something and I got it. Thank you so much, FDA. So these continue to remain a high priority, even though there's a cash crunch right now.
I mean, even though you see I'm sorry, but even though you see those responses on Twitter does not mean that, it's actually affecting everyone it should. When are those numbers are those numbers ever going to be discovered, or are they ever going to be analyzed or looked at?
So when you say those numbers, I assume you're talking about how many people are impacted and what kind of impact it had. Is that what you're referring to?
Right, because you can't really look at Twitter and say, oh, well, there's a lot of responses, so certainly this is everyone. Not everyone has access. That's
a great point. So I guess the government doesn't go in and specifically look at this period of time. The Government Accountability Office does from time to time go in and look at specific issues and specific concerns. And if appropriate, they will evaluate this piece and go, well, you didn't handle this as well as you learned. Here are the lessons you take from it. What we have to be careful about is Monday morning quarterbacking. I'm from Philadelphia right now. Quarterbacking is really hot. Nick Foles is doing really well. So I'm not going to discuss that, mostly because my knowledge of football is severely limited. But it's great in Philadelphia right now. But the key piece here being, it's a bad idea to go in and say, you know what, in in a time of crunch, a time of cash crunch, we're going to double check your decisions, even though we know we're not giving you the tools to accomplish what you need to do. So your point's well taken, which is you can't use one-offs on Twitter, but the alternative is they could have just said, we aren't going to look at these at all, and if you're a patient, oh well, you're going to be impacted. They're trying their hardest, and I think that's a good sign.
Well, what did they do before Twitter ever existed? How did they know what was an issue and what was not?
So they would often use things like press releases to communicate, but it was a one-way communication, right? So we as patients, we as healthcare providers, we as consumers never quite heard about the impact they're having, and we weren't hearing the decisions in as much of a real-time scenario as we are hearing right now, because press releases have to be vetted, they have to be reviewed, they have to be sent to the right people, those press releases will be released, you have to be sort of in tune with it. Mm-hmm. They're sort of cutting out the middleman, and they're saying, we'll still use those as necessary, but we are going to directly communicate as well,
so
which I think is great.
What I'm hearing is it's not that they stopped working with the methods they've used previously, like patients or people can still call in and discuss or ask questions. They can still write, assuming that the shutdown goes that long. But just so happens that Twitter is a new medium, new theater for these conversations to happen, for these comments to be made, for the two-way convo to actually, for the dialogue to happen, right? So what this does is it actually, do you think it might hinder the response because they're having to answer as many?
So, I want to be clear about this, which is it's not the first time they've used a system like Twitter. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was looking at a very, very reputable law firm, and they did an analysis on the impact. And one of the things they found was that they landed up quoting a tweet from January 2018. And I thought that was really interesting because this happens so often, this problem of a government shutdown, that now it's almost easy to get caught up in what you're trying to look at and mixing them up. So we had a similar shutdown situation last year, which I think is interesting, and there were tweets associated with that at that time as well. So it's not the first time it's happened, but it's just a really interesting scenario of how we're changing the conversation is the point I was making.
Right. I guess the question I'm asking is, with not focusing on Twitter being a newish platform for this dialogue, but the sheer volume of communication do you think that is hindering anything regarding the response?
No, I don't think it's hindering the response in the same way, because it's not like they are required to respond to every single one of them and in every single question that's asked. It's really more of an analysis of what is the trending question. Which ones do we want to respond to? For example, when I look at Commissioner Gottlieb's communications, one of the big things that comes across is every time he tweets, you'll get people who are for the prevention of banning of kratom responding, going, we want you to legalize it. Some people will use this as an opportunity to say, why are you targeting people with opioid addictions? Those communications are happening for many, many, many reasons. The FDA is not directly responding to those. Mm-hmm. They're choosing which issues to respond to and when to respond to them. So they don't tend to be one-off, one-on-one communications, if that makes sense.
Here's another question for you about Twitter, and this is the last question, I promise, on this.
No, you're good.
But with all the concern about, Russian hacking going through social media aspects and actually jumping in and maybe pushing a topic more than others, kind of showing a certain sense of priority over others. Do you think that would taint the idea of using Twitter as a sample group for the overall population needs?
I don't fully understand your question. Are you saying that since Twitter is being impacted or being influenced, we might have the wrong questions being asked? Is that what
yes. So it's easy for a minority group to amplify or push one question or desire or what have you. Like if you wanted some off-label use for a product to be approved,
right.
Right. They could start some social campaign and make it appear as though more people
it's a big issue.
Make it appear as though it's a bigger issue than it really is, and that would kind of supersede something that really is an issue.
So it's a great point, and that's exactly the type of scenario you're seeing, which is people with vested interests in different priorities are raising those concerns. But that doesn't mean that the FDA is necessarily going to respond to those people at that point. They may choose to respond in other ways, and this may not be the time they choose to respond. Mm-hmm. So it's a valid question, but the FDA is being wise about which points to respond to and when to respond. And let's sort of take that step further, and it's this prioritization or risk stratification process that the FDA is using is playing out not only in the context of communications, but also in the context of how the FDA spends its money. For example, it's choosing that it will not accept new applications under these different user fees, so PDUFA, GDUFA, BSUFA, Animal Drug User Fee Act, Animal Generic Drug User Fee Act.
These acronyms.
None of those.
Sorry. It's like you're making up words. It's awesome.
I know. It does come across really ridiculous, doesn't it? But
yeah,
each of those, the FDA said that they aren't going to accept any new applications right now. They simply either don't have the funding or the manpower, one of those two, to go after it right now.
So are they pushing clinical research, just that the ones that have already submitted? Is that an ongoing, or is that deemed unnecessary?
Again, it depends on what type of clinical research it is, and again, the importance of it, not in terms of is it an important project, but how is it going to impact patients, is playing a huge this part of the decision-making process. They are using that also, like I said, in generic drugs. They are using it in the case of carryover user fees. It's being used for changes being affected and for prior approval supplements, etc. Mm-hmm. So again, we have a PowerPoint on this that we're happy to share. If people are looking for it, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to share them. You can also add me on LinkedIn, and it'll be on my LinkedIn as well. Biologics are affected in the same way. Interestingly, over-the-counter drugs, all OTC monograph activities are being paused right now. Mm-hmm. But here's another interesting thing to me, which is tobacco. Even though some of us would say tobacco is not where the FDA should be spending its money or its time, interestingly enough, Commissioner Gottlieb has come out and said, you know what? We think that vaping and e-cigarettes are impacting kids, and we don't want to stand for that. We're going to use public money to, at this moment, make sure that these companies are being, the e-cigarette companies are being appropriate and targeted in their efforts to combat this rise of children using e-cigarettes. So it's definitely going to be a continuing area of interest. I know Commissioner Gottlieb put out a message saying he's reaching out to the CEOs of these companies, making sure that they are sticking to the commitments they've made. Importation-wise, he's come out and said that we're going to continue to monitor drugs coming in through the mail facilities, detaining products, examining products. But these are all continuing to be impacted. Like, one of the big things that came out and said is that inspections often require travel, but the travel would be impacted because it requires money. So the FDA came out with a new internal travel policy for this period because obviously the type of inspections will be impacted. So will there be no impact on patients? No, there probably will be some kind of impact, but the damage is being minimized to the extent possible. But we can keep going on talking about this. We don't want to belabor the point, but stay tuned. There'll probably be more. Hopefully this won't take too long, but again, both President Trump and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi are suggesting that this may take longer than people want. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi came out and said that she's trying to introduce legislation to end the shutdown, but we don't know where that'll go. Stay tuned. We'll have more hopefully as we continue.
And I hope it ends soon as well. But we were actually, something we mentioned earlier in this podcast was how potentially dangerous recalls could be. That's actually a podcast we'll be discussing next.
Thank you for listening to the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. If you have any questions for Darshan, reach out via Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.